Today we are learning basketball with Ahmed Jama. You can find him on Twitter at SlipTheScreen. He covers the NBA draft and grassroots basketball scouting with Swish Theory and Next Up BBall. And we're here to dive into a little March Madness and whose stock could rise in the draft, whose stock might slip a little. I can't wait to dive into all these different names. There's so many different factors. But before we do, how are you doing today, Ahmed?
Doing good, man. This is the best time of the year, in my opinion, dude. You got like the NBA regular season coming to a close. You got March Madness, the best tournament in all of sports. So, yeah, it's exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I can't wait. I mean, you said it. Nothing better than March. Just diving into all these teams when, anything could happen. It feels like as the years go on, the teams get closer and closer when it comes to their level of competition. And that might change a little bit here as NIL kind of widens the gap between some of the top and lower teams. But it does feel like we see more 15 seed upsets or 16 seed upsets, whatever it is, much lower seeds being much more competitive in these games. And it's not as much of kind of like a one-off when Steve Nash leads some underdog 15 seed to an upset. And that, becomes the storyline. So it's almost a little more common. And, speaking of Steve, and I would love to just kind of hear any legends from March Madness that pop to mind. Like who are some of the first names that pop into your mind from March Madness before we even dive into the draft stuff?
I love this question, man, because it's like when my initial introduction to March Madness obviously isn't as like trying to analyze the game or really think about it as a spectacle. And I remember my very first, I don't know how old I was. I was maybe elementary school when Northern Iowa beat Kansas. And Ali Farokhmanesh is just the name that comes to mind for some reason. Like Northern Iowa, I couldn't point out Iowa on a map at that stage of my life. And this team brought down, I think it was Morris Twins, Sharon Collins. It was a stacked roster. So that was like the chaos. Like you just don't get that kind of chaos. I think Farokhmanesh is actually like an assistant for Colorado State. We might be touching on a little bit over this, but yeah, you don't really see that dynamic in other sports, which is what makes the tournament so special.
Right. I mean, legends are made here. Like you'll see a guy like Kemba Walker go on to an all NBA legendary, like Hall of Fame career. And yet I feel like the majority of basketball fans still say cardiac Kemba. Like that's the first thing that comes to mind when Kemba's name gets thrown out in there, like a legend, and for good reason. And, a Jimmer Fredette comes to mind. Carmelo Anthony with Syracuse back in the day, just that one and done, undefeated like feel of it all, I guess. Everything he did there was incredible. So, there's a ton of names to dive into, but, we're going to specifically dive into the March Madness from the NBA draft perspective on the idea that these are some of the most important games of these prospects' lives. They're on the biggest stage. This is where the majority of people will see them, will remember them from the college stance. And so I think that it might not be the deciding factor for what teams look for or view in prospects, but I got to imagine it's at least a factor. It's as big of a small sample as you can get when it comes to small samples that matter for these guys. And at the end of the day, it's the last thing that decision makers see before the draft. It's that last memory, whether it's recency bias or just the last thing they see and they think about when they hear a prospect's name was what did he do most recently and how did he handle, whether it's the clutch or the eyeballs, the pressure. That stuff matters in the way that these prospects get talked about. And there's some names that come to mind. I think ultimately this exercise reminds me of Shabazz Napier, the way the first name that really pops up in terms of draft stock from March Madness, where he catches the eye of LeBron James during March Madness. LeBron shares that famous tweet, and then the Miami Heat go ahead and draft Shabazz Napier later that summer. So,
was it because a couple months or a couple weeks later, right? I think that was the year he left. He went back to Cleveland. So it's funny. Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, it's funny how all that stuff happened.
Right, and we have to assume that being seen on the biggest stage helped that happen, and he wasn't even there to play with LeBron, which is pretty funny when you mention it that way. And some other names that pop into mind that it's not necessarily that these players didn't exist before or they weren't known before, but it's it's that maybe their status or their stock around the league just simply rises from achieving the biggest goal they can at this level. Like, Davion Mitchell and Jared Butler playing for Baylor that took down that undefeated Jalen Suggs and Andrew Nembhard Gonzaga team. That's a team that comes to mind where it's like maybe that boosted their stock just a little bit. And some of the other like famous examples probably recently would be like Dante DiVincenzo, like big swagoo for Villanova. Like he has this epic shooting run and gets himself drafted with a strong team. Like maybe it was a few slots higher than he was projected to go before March Madness. And so I'd love to dive into this class, but are there any names I'm leaving off here for you that, come to mind when it comes to guys that had a great March Madness and then saw their draft stock affected by it?
So I think of names like Malachi Richardson when Syracuse made a run to the Final Four, and he was a guy that I think he was going to return to school. He was probably the most extreme example in like recent memory of a guy just going from, returner, all of a sudden he's a one and done type guy, gets drafted in the first round, and that's like a little bit of maybe the bad side or like the unfortunate circumstances that could happen. When teams put too much stock, put too much weight into like such a tiny sample of games. But even like somewhat recently, like you're a Magic fan, you do great coverage on the Magic. Not that it drastically altered his positioning in the draft, but I remember Paolo's run in March Madness, like the game he had against Texas Tech. It's just an opportunity, just adding really good tape kind of, for a lot of people that weren't watching, grinding out ACC regular season games. It was a chance, a glimpse into like the kind of playmaker he was at that stage of his career. So yeah, it can, like, public perception does matter, and I do think it, like, I don't know how much. The mileage probably varies from team to team, but definitely, like, contributes, I think, to some decisions made on the draft front, whether, teams or people want to admit it or not.
Yeah, and those are some good call outs. And even with a guy like Paulo, like we're talking about the difference between being in the conversation for a top 3 pick and being the number 1 pick because of how strong that play was. Maybe there's a handful of games in there that wins a decision maker over. And we're trying to reiterate, like, one big reason I got into one big reason I got into grassroots scouting even more so over the last few years was because I felt like I myself was overrating the college sample size where, it's the biggest stage for a lot of these prospects. It's the lens we kind of view almost in a developmental league kind of way, is like, this is the stage before the NBA. Can they prove it here? How do they look against their peers at this level? And we almost underrate the fact that there's all these years of basketball sample size before that happens. And that full development cycle is what's important to evaluate. So I think all that is to say, like, every game is a sample size, or every game is a data point, and this stage is full of the biggest games, and those data points are seen by the most people. Like if someone only has enough time to watch 3 games on a prospect, I would hope NBA teams have more time. But if there's 100 prospects and they got to divvy them up one way or another, there's only so much time to really focus. So they're going to probably pick either the strongest game, the worst game, and an average game of the prospect, or maybe the biggest stage that prospect played on, whether it's a championship or a playoff run or a March Madness run. So at the end of the day, I think it is a small sample size, but ends up being probably the biggest individual factor among any game that player has ever played. But that being said, one bad game isn't going to ruin your draft stock. One great game isn't going to save it. But it's interesting to me how March Madness gets viewed in the draft talks, in the draft cycle. And to be clear, we're really talking about the consensus public media perception of the draft big board and the best players available. Like, who do we think could go on a hot run and see themselves being projected from, say, like the 30s or 40s up to the 20s all of a sudden, or someone that's in the 20s up to the lottery as a lock, or whatever it may be. And, we could dive right into this class. And I think one interesting question to dive into first is surrounds Ace Bailey and his stock, his status. So he's not in the tournament. His team, Rutgers, with Dylan Harper, he's not in the tournament. And personally, I think that will only help his draft stock. The unknown, like, not, no offense to him and his game, but I think there are question marks around some of his self creation, his playmaking, his handle to create his own shot and create for others. And so kind of not having that out on a national media stage could end up benefiting him, because it's kind of like a question mark, like a little bit of a mystery box where he hasn't played in a few weeks or even months by the time the draft comes around. And you really just kind of see the pros when that happens. You kind of forget about some of the weaknesses, I think. So my question here around Ace is, he has been the projected third pick pretty much this entire cycle, right behind Cooper Flagg and Dylan Harper. And there's a lot of names, especially freshmen, who are in March Madness. So could we see any of these projected lottery picks, mostly freshmen, steal that third overall mock draft slot from Ace in all these mock drafts, where, say, just to throw some names at you, maybe one pops out that you really think could have a hot run, and just swipe that, by the time the draft rolls around, they will be viewed as the consensus number 3 pick over Ace because of how strong their March Madness run, along with everything else they've done. But that could be the ultimate deciding factor, between a VJ Edgecombe, who is in those talks, a Trey Johnson, a Derik Queen, Jeremiah Fears, even Asa Newell, Jase Richardson, Kasparis, Yakachonis. I mean, these are guys that are all projected in or near the lottery, and they're all impactful freshmen that could really have a nice run. And there's some fun, they're leaders in different stats in different areas. But I want to hear what you think about that idea in general. Or do you think Ace not playing is pretty much just written in pencil that he will be the third pick and everyone else is kind of fighting for fourth?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, if Ace hasn't placed up until this point, hasn't warranted a slide, then I don't know what would. And that's not really like I don't think that's an indictment of his play. I think he had a stretch when Dylan Harper was out where he really did start picking up his performance and had a couple great games. The Indiana game comes to mind where he was just on an absolute heater in that game and had a couple similar games. But I think it's weird with this class in that I feel like kind of in more niche spaces that there's a lot of fluctuations between the top of the class. Like some people had VJ2 or Colin Murray Boyles in the top 5 and just like a bunch of different prospects. But at least on the mainstream, and that could just be reflective of, the mainstream boards have a lot more access than those of us do on Twitter, and maybe this is just more reflective of how front offices feel. But it seems like on the mainstream boards, the top 5 or 6 has more or less been crystallized since like the new year, the turn of the new year. It really doesn't seem like there's been much fluctuation between all the guys you mentioned, Kasparis, Yakachonis, and Trey Johnson and VJ Edgecombe. I think if there is, I do not think that if Ace were to fall, I don't think anyone's going to rise to the point where they are the consensus number. I'd be very shocked. Well, I think that plays into, I think teams for the most part are past the point of putting so much weight into such a small sample of games, no matter, how big the stage is. But I also think, I think if there were to be someone that like inserts themselves into the mix, you look at like someone like Khaman Maluach, how dominant Duke has been over the course of the season. It seems like Cooper Flagg is going to be back in the fold this Friday, but say he's not, or say he's on a minutes restriction for the first game or two, that could be, and this Duke team kind of continues the trend of dominance that they've shown throughout the regular season so far. That he could be a guy that inserts. He's a guy who I think belongs in that conversation, and he could see his name inserted into that mix. And then amongst the other guys, I think, if anything, I think guys like Kasparis, Yakachonis, point guard for Illinois, and not so much VJ, but maybe Trey Johnson to a slightly lesser degree than KJ. They're almost on the back foot where they're almost kind of defending their spot in the lottery. Kasparis has had kind of a rough stretch of games. He had a forearm injury during the regular season, missed a couple games, and never really like found the form that he had earlier in the season. And Trey more than likely will just stay in the spot he's been mocked since since the preseason. It feels like since the very first, 2025 mock draft drop, the 2 years ago, I feel like Trey Johnson's mocked it top 5 or 6. But yeah, that's a long-winded way to say I don't really see anyone overtaking Ace or really laying claim to that third pick. But maybe Khaman, Maluach is someone that could insert themselves.
I think that's a good shout. Maluach definitely deserves to be in that conversation. And you hit on a ton of great points with Duke and with Flagg, and we'll dive into Duke in a second here because that's my next question. But before we dive into those guys, I think you are right ultimately that if Ace hasn't lost his stock to this point, there probably isn't anything that someone else can do to necessarily take that clear consensus number 3 spot. Now, like in a full what if scenario, if Jeremiah Fears wins the whole national championship, if Trey Johnson, I mean, it's unlikely because Texas is barely in the tournament to begin with. But if he wins the whole tournament, or Derik Queen, or VJ Edgecombe, or even Maluach, as you say, that's where I think the conversation at least gets posed out there. Like, if Baylor wins the whole thing and VJ Edgecombe actually looks amazing, hits all his threes, makes all these steals, shows off this athleticism that he's known for, this change of pace burst, that's a guy that I think could get kind of penciled in at 3, could jump Ace, but there's just not. You really need the what if to be immaculate to reach this consensus level that we're kind of talking to. And so to dive into the Duke side of things, that was my next question. Was Cooper Flagg is now a wild card. The coach says he's 100% ready to go, no problems, but he's been out 2 games. He rolled his ankle. He might have a little bit of a lingering ankle issue for the whole tournament. So what does that mean for everyone else's draft stock on Duke? Because Duke is one of the favorites heading in. Cooper Flagg is bona fide number 1 pick. It's already happening. Nothing's going to happen to his stock. But to me, Kon Knueppel is a guy who has one of the more, let's say, volatile draft stock range of outcomes because of all these different factors. Because he's the one that'll probably be asked to step up offensively to run the offense primarily with if Flagg is out or limited. And Duke's success will ultimately probably rely on his offensive output and his creation as much as others. But I'm also thinking that maybe that means a role player like Sion James gets a lot more usage and gets a lot more eyeballs on his game, and maybe he's the one that ultimately has the biggest swing. And you also mentioned Maluach here, where if they win the whole thing, if Duke wins the whole thing, and he's just clearly a star player, that's a guy who could really lock in maybe a top 5 pick status. Whereas, Kon Knueppel, I've seen him mocked as high as 8 or 9 and as low as early 20s. And that's why I think this kind of tournament could really define where exactly people view him as, if they win it all and he's the leading scorer, he's a clear top 10, top 15 guy. If they have an early exit and it's because of him, for whatever reason, maybe he's pushed off to the later of the first round. And that's the kind of swing that we're talking about here, where a handful of games might affect the perception of these guys. So do you think Kon's stock is that volatile? And you've already hit on, how great Maluach kind of could be and how high he could get, or do you think ultimately it won't really affect anyone with Duke, or maybe Sion James or a role player ends up getting the biggest boost to their own stock because of maybe a limited Cooper Flagg?
Yeah, I think if anyone's going to see kind of an upswing in where they're perceived or their mock draft standing because of this March Madness run or lack of a run Duke's about to make, I think it's more than likely going to be the role players. Guys like Tyrese Proctor could potentially come into the fold and work their way into being a solid draft prospect, which is a fringe, second rounder that test and then probably more than likely return. He could be someone that goes. Sion James could go from priority UDFA 2-way type guy to being drafted and maybe getting a guaranteed deal if he has a particularly impressive run. But I think with guys like Knueppel and Maluach, it's gonna. I think typically, and this is somewhat connected to the Bailey conversation, guys that have the combination of even if they're just flashes in the pan, but somewhat consistent string of good performances. They're highly regarded recruits or highly considered guys like with good priors or just like came in with like pretty good draft buzz and then are playing on these like high achieving teams like Knueppel and Maluach have. I think they're more than likely going to stay around where they're projected to before the tournament. I don't really see Kon. I think he could. There's potential for him to make some ground. I thought he acquitted himself really well in the handful of games that Cooper missed in the ACC. I mean, he was ACC player of the tournament. I think he had probably I wouldn't say his best stretch of games from just like a pure efficiency standpoint, but I thought like on both ends he really put together some solid performances. And Maluach, like I previously mentioned, another guy that could potentially bump themselves up a handful of spots with a good game, with a good series of games.
Yeah, and right on, hit the nail right on the head with Kon, and especially these last few games where they've asked him to take over, and he's really shown his game is fairly scalable, especially offensively. That's what probably impressed me the most was his ability to run the offense, to create a look for Khaman to finish, running a little pick and roll. Because I've already thought he's flashed enough of the off-ball stuff to be very intrigued offensively. Like he can shoot, he can dribble, he can pass, and I'm still a little confused if he's actually big for his position. When I look at him, I think he's a little small, but then the book will tell me he's 6'7". You mentioned he might be 6'5". Like I see an average or below average size guard out there, but maybe he's actually taller than meets the eye.
Yeah, I think for a guard, he is pretty good positional size, like whether it be 6'5", 6'6", something along those lines. He's like really sturdily built. Like I think that's probably what separates him from a lot of guys with similar skill sets. Is Kon leverages his strength really well and just has this, even at a young age. For 3, I think that's where things get a little tricky. I don't think he has obviously is like the athletic limitations, and then he's probably a little undersized for 3. I don't think he has. I'm just once again, this is speculation until thank God all these guys have measured now. But this is speculation until the combine. But I'm guessing he probably doesn't have exemplary length for a wing, like a true wing. But I think that's kind of been I wouldn't say surprising because it's something he flashed in Grassroots and something I kind of I mentioned on our now defunct but former podcast at the Draft Council. I think it's kind of a notch in Kon's belt that he doesn't need to be thought of as a traditional wing, and something you got to show with Flagg out. He can't operate on the perimeter. He can't create for himself and others. But yeah, his positional size is kind of it's kind of up in the air with Kon. It kind of depends how you think of him. If you think of him as more of a wing, and you don't think some of the off the dribble stuff is gonna fly necessarily at the next level, then yeah, he's probably a little undersized.
Yeah, and on that point, he plays really tough. Like he'll get like he might not like be the biggest, most aesthetically athlete kind of stereotype looking guy out there, but he plays tough. He'll get in your shoulder. Like he's not giving up an inch. So credit to him. And I also, just to double back on Ace, I almost feel bad like I didn't highlight any of the strengths and just skipped over as to why his stock's going to fall. Like I'm all like you mentioned some of the big games. Like he obviously has some very impressive strengths. And I think he is so polarizing because the strengths are so aesthetically pleasing and what you generally want in the draft, a big wing that can hit tough shots, hit threes, very mobile, agile movement shooter, and just defensive feel, makes highlight plays, especially the game you mentioned where like he's everywhere defensively, forcing turnovers, getting downhill, like super impressive athleticism. And then I think the weaknesses can be just as glaring at times. So like, will he be a self-creator at the next level, or will he ultimately be best as kind of an off-ball play finisher who just has to knock down the shot, not create it? So that's some of the reasons why I think his stock could be a little more volatile, but he's pretty much penciled in for the 3rd pick. So just wanted to give a quick shout back to Ace before we move on. But I'm glad you brought up Tyrese Proctor, because that idea is another question that I was kind of mulling around was, is there any players that come to mind for you where a big, deep run in March Madness could ultimately keep a player in the draft this year when maybe they aren't, maybe they're just on the fringes of it and they're actually leaning towards returning to school next year, but maybe their team gets really far. They're the ones that are catch fire from deep. that are super exciting and get the national spotlight, and suddenly they're first round picks this year? Is there anyone that comes to mind? Because for me, it's a couple names like Tahaad Pettiford. I love his talent. He's a guy that, to me, I have him as a late lottery pick this year anyway. So that's a guy like I just love what I see out of him. So, he's a guy that's probably going to come back next year. But if Auburn wins the whole thing and he's the leading scorer and he's on the number 1 overall seed and they beat Duke or something in the national stage, like he'll get some notoriety for that. So you think something like that is enough to get him to enter the draft, or to hear that he will be drafted so he won't go back to school? And, on that, same idea for an Otega Oweh. I love it, Kentucky. Like I have him really high. Will Riley is really high BPM impact metric, but he's a guy that for Illinois that might ultimately come back next year. So these are guys that are probably going to return in college to next year, but I think they're all talented enough for one reason or another to go as, be in the conversation at the very least to be drafted, let alone maybe potential first round pick, in my opinion. But do any of those guys pop out, or do you think that type of scenario could kind of, be the deciding factor that pushes a guy into the draft this year?
It's really interesting you mentioned like the kind of guys you've mentioned as far as being either like in the Will Riley, Tahaad Pettiford camp, where the appeal is kind of the unknown, where it's like, all right, the freshman could the small sample size be of benefit to them, or some mid-major types. I feel like I was thinking of when you brought up the question, I was thinking of a few mid-major types, but in Will Riley and Tahaad Pettiford's case, Riley was a guy who came in to some acclaim this season as far as one and done, being projected as a potential one and done. He was someone. It's funny enough, I wrote about for Swish before he'd even reclassified to this class. It was the assumption that I assumed at that point he was playing on EYBL circuit this past summer. I thought he was going to come back and be a high school senior, but yeah, lately, I mean, he's been the better of the two freshmen for Illinois for, I'd say, going on a month now, about something like that. And just the shot making has kind of come into form. He's just such an opportunistic scorer. Illinois as a team has looked so shaky as of late that I think it would be I think Riley more than likely is going to be gone regardless, but it could be the difference between him, working his way up a handful of spots. Definitely, especially the kind of production Will Riley brings to the table as far as just being like a tough shot maker, flawed, but a creator at this level. So if he does go on a hot streak, I mean, his best games are, with a lot of players, this is the case, but especially in Will Riley, a guy who kind of struggles. He struggles as a defender and sometimes as a facilitator. Like his production kind of lives and dies by how well he shoots or how effectively he's able to put the ball in the basket. So if he has a couple good scoring games, I think, if I'm not mistaken, they're going to play the winner of Texas and Xavier. And I think that this is an extremely, niche. I may be the only person excited for this, but Dalen Swain was wing for Xavier. He's a phenomenal defender, one of the better wing defenders in the country. If they win that game against Texas, I think him and Riley is a really interesting match. That's something Riley, performs really well and has a good day. That's a pretty massive notch in his belt, I think. That's as close an approximation, or Swain is as close an approximation of an NBA defender as, you can see really at the college level. And then in Tahaad's case, for as good as Tahaad's been for stretches this season, I wonder, I feel maybe I'm running in the wrong circle. Maybe I haven't seen him on as many boards. I think the Swish board we did was one of the only ones where I'd seen him projected in the first round. That may be, maybe that's one of those instances of intel where people behind the scenes know Tahaad's coming back. I can't imagine. I imagine he's due, again, this is not reporting, just speculation on my part, but I imagine he's due for a little bit of a pay bump on the NIL front if he comes back to Auburn. So I imagine there's some financial incentive to come back. But, Auburn has as good a chance to win it as anyone. I think you're absolutely right if Tahaad strings together some good performances. And a few of those games, Janai Broom was out with a turned ankle sprain. Tahaad played great. Like, Tahaad had some ridiculously good games. I'm trying to think of one. I think Ole Miss was one of them where he'd gone off, but I wouldn't be surprised. Tahaad, another one where it's going to be heavily dependent on the shooting, and he, as much as anyone, is capable of putting together a hot shooting stretch. So yeah, both of those guys could be in position to, climb up draft boards, especially with how much uncertainty there is really after in any draft, but especially with this one, really after the lottery, after the top 20. I think there's probably a little bit of a drop off there. But yeah, those two are definitely big ones. And then as far as like mid-major kind of returners, I think this is two guys who I'm actually in the process of writing for Swish, but I think with a couple of good games, they could like cement themselves as far as definitely test. They're probably going to test regardless, but two guys that I think could end up staying if they have a good stretch are Bennett Stirtz, guard for Drake, who's started to pick up a lot of like mainstream traction. I think Drake's like a popular upset pick in the first round versus Missouri, and he's been Drake's offense has gone where Bennett Stirtz has gone. He has, I think, a 98% minute share. He never leaves the court. He's running a million pick and rolls a game, and it's been wildly productive and just wildly efficient. So I think if that continues, he's only played, if I recall, 3 top 100 opponents this season. So this is going to be a quarter, potentially, if they lose, is going to be a quarter of his top 100 production. It's going to be in this game, or a quarter of his top 100 opponents. He had 3 games versus Bradley, so top 100 team. And then a guy you and I were actually talking about previously, Miles Byrd. He's got to love
there he
him.
is. You took both my top picks right off the bat, so we're on the same wavelength. And great. Talk about Byrd for a minute, and then I'll dive into some of these guys.
I mean, Byrd, one of the better wing defenders in the country, I think, is really feasted in the kind of aggressive, swarming San Diego State defensive scheme. And the offense has just been tough to come by, like both watching the games and then obviously from an efficiency standpoint. I think he is shooting under 40% on the season so far, which is not ideal for a mid-major wing. But I think Carolina's a good opportunity. They have a couple potential one and dones in Ian Jackson and Drake Powell that he could perform well against. And then I want to double check so I don't get it wrong to see they'd be playing Ole Miss. So that's another opportunity against like an SEC team, a highly regarded team, for Byrd to perform. And he's one I think I would love to see Miles Byrd in this draft. I think he is like certified a 2025 guy, but I think right now, pretty much across all mainstream outlets, he's a second rounder. So if he doesn't have like a great showing, this could be the difference between him, coming back and just and staying in the draft.
Yeah, some great names there, as we were just saying. I'm really glad you shouted out both of those guys. You're the one that really put Miles Byrd on my radar to begin with, and I've loved his game ever since. I mean, it was very quick to see that this guy's an NBA player, and like you pointed out all the reasons why. He's 39th right now on Givney's mock draft, and to me, like he's another guy that I have right in that late lottery conversation on my board, like right in that Tahaad range as well. Where, but for Miles, like you mentioned, like he can defend, he can hit the pull up shot, he can run the offense a little bit, create the offense for himself, for others. He's just a smart two-way basketball player, like two-way feel for the game, really high level processor with some shooting touch, like. A tall wing that can create his own shot and defend, and like 3-point range, can drive and kick, can create for others. Like, what's not to like there? I also think you hit on the real theme of this podcast, which is guys that are probably in that wide range of like could go anywhere from 20th to 40th to undrafted based on who's drafting and what happens lately. And it is like you said, like. You could get a nice notch in the belt taking down a legit opponent that you haven't gotten to play all year because you're at a mid-major. Maybe you beat up a few big teams and you're the reason why. That matters to these decision makers, doing it against the best competition. And so, maybe if they come back, it leads to, more interest in the transfer portal or something. But I think it would help draft stock. And, on Miles Byrd, he's 28th in the whole D1 in steals per game with 2.1. On Bennett Stirtz, he's 41st in scoring. 18th in assist to turnover ratio and 26th in steals per game among all D1 players. Shout out Mike Gribb. He just always finding these guys. I want to say he's one of the first that put Stirtz out kind of in a basketball Twitter radar. He's just, shouting any team, anytime, and he'll just find some pros. So shout out to Gribb, man. He kills it out here. But I'm really glad you mentioned them. And just to wrap up on Tahaad's side, Tahaad Pettiford, I really like the points you made. We talked about him on the pod before with Nathan, who covers Auburn, and it was the idea where they expect Pettiford to come back, and they're going to have a loaded team next year where Janai Broome is getting drafted, but they'll have Chad Baker back. They'll have who is it? Caden Magwood is coming in, a really exciting, marquee freshman type will join him in the backcourt. But ultimately, the biggest difference to me is Pettiford should be starting and be the number one option with Broome no longer there, because Broome is top 50 in scoring and also 15th in blocks per game. But Pettiford will take a lot of that usage. So in my opinion, his opportunity, his usage will all go up, and that will be how we see what his averages ultimately look like with a more expanded role for Auburn next year. So I think that will ultimately be what he does. But to me, he's just so talented that if he's like a big reason for this March Madness success, like I just think he's got to be in conversations. But that is kind of what we're getting at here. Like, will it, like if Pettiford won the whole thing and was the leading scorer, is that enough to get him drafted this year? And personally, I think yes. But in terms of actually being drafted, I don't know. That's the fun unknown of this exercise. But someone else that I think is pretty kind of, let's say, polarizing in these conversations is Boogie Fland. He was a projected lottery pick for much of the season. He didn't have the best season. He started falling a little bit down the big board, and then he got hurt. We thought he was out for the season. Now he's coming back just in time for March Madness. How will that affect Arkansas, who's also missing another player in Thoreau? I don't know. I mean, it's a big wild card. It kind of reminds me of I'm a Magic guy, so 2009 Orlando Magic. Jameer Nelson goes down after winning an All Star. We trade for Rafer Alston, make the finals, but Jameer's finally healthy. He gets healthy, and he played great in the matchups against Derek Fisher and the Lakers that year. So Stan Van Gundy goes ahead and plays Jameer, and it becomes this whole storyline that like is Jameer still his normal self? Is he ruining the chemistry of the last few months after they brought in Rafer, but is he also adding the chemistry of all the years of Magic basketball before that back? Like, is he helping or hurting ultimately, trying to work someone back in to a team that already has a rhythm? It's almost like throwing a wrench into the mix. So I'm interested to see, does Flan look like himself? Does he look healthy? And I would imagine the team is better off with him there because of the talent. But he's a guy where he's projected now 38th on Givony's mock draft, where you could have seen him as high as late lottery on the early season mock draft. So that's a guy where the talent is obviously there. He's seen his stock go up and down already. So could a little bit of a March Madness run save his draft status, where now he goes off for a few games and maybe he's back to the top 20 all of a sudden because he's shown like, oh, he's still got it.
Yeah. With Boogie, it's kind of tough because he would because of how up and down it had been for him prior to the hand injury. And I think if he's anything close to with all his flaws you've shown in like prior to the injury, if he's anything close to 100%, he's going to help Arkansas because they just need a plus decision maker for all his flaws. Boogie was one of the more consistent playmakers in the country. You look at a lot of like impact metrics from before he got injured, like lineup data. Boogie was one of the more impactful players in the country because they just didn't have. They put a lot of playmaking duties on Boogie's shoulders, and he still, even if he wasn't the most effective scorer, I'm looking at it right now. He shot 29% on twos against top 100 comp. It's not great. It's not ideal, but he never turned the ball over, and he racked up a lot of assists and was just effective as a distributor, which DJ Wagner, not necessarily his strength, more of a scoring guard, kind of conventional combo guard type of player. So I think in the short term, he would help Arkansas a ton. As far as his draft stock, Boogie's one I personally hope comes back because I think he's very talented and he's extremely young for the class. We talk about a guy like Tahaad Pettiford. Boogie's basically a full year younger than Tahaad, even though they're in the same class. And I think coming back a year, developing physically, I think a lot of his, the limitations he's shown, finishing on the interior and just getting downhill were because of kind of the underdeveloped strength and just contact balance. His driver was not there because he's young and he's 6'2", 6'3", maybe 180 pounds. And I think adding on a little bit of muscle could really help because I think he's a very talented defender. He's really talented at the point of attack and worth drafting. I think it's just a matter of it's all about finding those guarantees. I think he'd be much better positioned if he were to return to Arkansas and flesh out some of those parts of his game that are kind of lacking at the moment. But if I could be caught with egg on my face, he could have a great run. I could be totally wrong, and Boogie is definitely a guy because of how highly considered he was in high school, and he did have good performances. I think of the Baylor game early in the season. I thought it was one of the better games a freshman played all year. I really do. I think on the defensive end, how he was navigating screens. He forced I think he only had maybe one or two steals, but he forced so many turnovers on illegal screens and it was just phenomenal defensively and then just a consistent decision maker offensively. So I think with a couple good games, he could definitely work his way back into late first round kind of pick. I think of another Arkansas player from a few years ago, Nique Smith, who was very similarly came off an injury, played poorly upon his return, but because of a high standing as a high school player, he still ended up getting drafted in the late first and getting that guaranteed rookie deal. So Boogie could find himself in the same boat with a handful of games.
Yeah, and you just never know which guard is going to go off. That's kind of the fun part of this exercise is we could literally sit here and name 30 guys that we like in the draft, and then it'll be the 55th player that is the one that hits all the threes that goes off on the winning team that makes a deep run. So that's kind of what's fun is we're not saying that all of this is going to happen, but just some hypotheticals. If say, another guy is Braden Smith for Purdue, where, he's 11th in Division I in assist to turnover ratio. He's really high in steals and scoring, especially in Big Ten ranks. He's a guy that could go off. I mean, and one other mid-major guy I kind of wanted to highlight was Nique Clifford and hear maybe your thoughts on his game. He's 42nd in D1 scoring with 19 points per game. There's a ton of other guys that we can dive into, but did you have any thoughts on him? Because he's another guy that's kind of in this tier that we're at, I think, where he's projected 31st on Givony's mock draft, the latest one from March 13th, I believe. But he's a guy where if he's the one that goes off for 20 points a game and wins a few rounds, he's a guy that could see his status raise a little bit, or at the very least, in the general consensus mock draft world where we see all these projections, he's a guy that could jump from projected 30th to projected 20th all of a sudden.
Yeah, Nique was another guy I'd written about for Swish Theory in our preseason roundtable as far as underrated returners. I think is what we'd called it. That doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, but just returners that we decided to discuss. I thought he was great last year, playing more a connectory role, and then this year I was genuinely really surprised how quickly he was able to kind of acclimate playing as a conventional primary, running a lot more ball screens, being effective doing so, and which is not traditional, or I wouldn't even say traditional, but in CSU's, it's kind of an egalitarian offense. They run out of 5 out, they run Princeton kind of concepts a lot, and Nique is just been the number one guy in that offense and they've relied on him a lot for this hot stretch they've gone on. They were not projected to win the Mountain West tournament and managed to do so, and he's definitely he was another mid-major guy I was thinking of that could definitely rise, not just through the tournament, because there's so many factors, but definitely through the tournament. I think he is going to be what has lately become a mid-major moneymaker in the combine scrimmages. I think he's a guy that should really crush in that kind of setting. It's open court athleticism. He doesn't really show much with CSU playing a more deliberate style. But yeah, I think Nique is a guy who should definitely, find himself working his way up the boards. I think another guy we talked about amongst the Swish guys and thought was just deservedly should be like a top 20 caliber guy. But yeah, Nique has I think a lot of room to climb on draft.
That's a great shout. And I was wondering if any big men pop into mind for this exercise, because normally it's, the small guard. Jimmer just hit 10 threes and won 5 games in a row, or whatever it is. That's or Kemba going off, Steph going off, Nash going off back in the day. I mean, it's a lot of guards that generally kind of get this, not stereotype, but just kind of this message around who they are as a player, and that end up catching fire going off from three. And some bigs, I caught my eye, but I was trying to really wonder how much a March Madness run would affect a big. So, there's guys like Danny Wolf that's projected 18th. There's Alex Condon on Florida, 26th. Ryan Kalkbrenner, 30th for Creighton. And then your guy, Jojo Tugler. Like, he's not even mocked on this mock draft. Like, he's not in the top 60, and yet you love this guy. He's 23rd in D1 in blocks per game. Like, he's a defensive anchor to you, right? Like, Houston has all these guards that are exciting, but he's your guy. So tell me, like, what he has to do to get himself drafted after March Madness.
Jojo, I wrote about before he'd even played a game for Houston. He was one of my favorites on the grassroots scene in 2022 that summer when he was just going into his senior summer. I thought he was probably on a game-to-game basis the most impactful guy in EYBL that summer. But he's another guy who I think he was on certain mocks. I think even Giovoni had him mocked and then fell out because it's not the blocks are great, and you mentioned that as like kind of his like box score sell. But I think he's averaging a little under 6 points a game. It's not like a traditional guy that people kind of go to bat for as far as a draft prospect. But Houston, he's number one in the country in defensive box plus minus. By most metrics, he has been a lot of impact metrics. He's been the best defender in the country. And if Houston, I think they're very well positioned based on how the bracket shook out to make a serious run this year. Like, I think their region stylistically has a lot of great matchups for them. I think maybe their toughest matchup could be in that in the second round versus the winner of Gonzaga and Georgia.
Yeah, that Gonzaga matchup is real potentially interesting because they're both top 10 Ken Palm teams is what I found, and Gonzaga is like an 8 seed in this tournament, and yet they're just playing as well as anybody. So that's the one I'm really interested to see, where it feels like either one could make a run, and yet they face each other second round potentially if they beat Georgia.
Absolutely. And even with Georgia, they've been one of the better defensive teams in the country. Austin Newell's a guy who I know you're really high on. I'm a fan of as well. And they have just tons of front court depth, physical front court players that are good defensively. So if Houston manages to make a run, and maybe this could be the year, this is the coronation for Kelvin Sampson. I think he's been one of the best players in college basketball, or best coaches in college basketball over the past decade. If this is the year that he wins a title and Tugler anchors that defense on that run, then yeah, he could definitely work his way in there. I think he's actually a guy, I think this is definitely kind of because this is when most people are watching the games. These are good, or at least fans are watching the games. And like I said, Tugler isn't going to grab you. His box score numbers aren't going to grab a lot of eyes. So I think people watching the game, seeing the impact on a game basis is going to be kind of what really strikes people as far as the overall sell as a prospect. But as far as other bigs, Ryan Kalkbrenner he's just been stellar for his entire career at Creighton, and I think 30th is entirely too low. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I want to say he was higher on the Swish board. I don't know what it will take, and it might not be this tournament run Creighton goes on or doesn't go on, because they have an extremely tough draw. Louisville is about as tough an 8 seed. I think they were many people, not just me, think they were wildly underseeded. And then if they do manage to beat Louisville, they get rewarded with Auburn and around the 32. So it's not exactly set up for Ryan Kalkbrenner to anchor a run, but he's just such a great big. I think the two Creighton guys who were drafted or who left last year, and Baylor Shireman and Trey Alexander were massive beneficiaries of Brian Kalkbrenner's screening and a little bit of playmaking he brought to the table, and then just like covering up for a lot of defensive deficiencies that some of the great players may have, like whether it be the two guys I just mentioned from last year or their point guard, Stephen Ashford, who I really enjoy watching, one of the better handles in D1, but not, a defensive stalwart by any means. So yeah, I think Ryan Kalkbrenner, I hope this is the weekend that people recognize how good he is. But he's a guy I think regardless should be highly considered amongst this class of bigs.
Yeah, it feels like he's been playing for Creighton for years. Like he's just been that like steady hand, steady force down there. He's 31st in points per game this year in D1. He's 4th in blocks per game. And he's just got a really all-around skill set. Like he can hit that open three, just a smart player on both ends. I remember randomly watching a lot of Creighton. I don't know why. It's just got to be that combination of talent and style of play. That must be it. And I'm sure it's just their conference, but they're always playing like it feels like they're playing 3 teams just in rotation every single weekend. Like I don't know what it is with those matchups, but I really liked Trey Alexander's game last year with him or playing off that. And I want to say Ryan Nembhard was there last year and now he's with Gonzaga, if I got that right, but he's another guy that pops into my mind from that team. And I mean, Kalkbrenner brings a lot, and I probably relatively lower on the big board side of things, but that's a great shout where like if they do overcome that insane schedule where it's they somehow upset Auburn or they make this big run, like he's a guy that'll get credit because he has big performances. I want to say, what was it? Wasn't it like the first game of the season he scored 50 or something like that? Like
I think he missed one shot from the field or something like that.
It was just an insane performance. So like that's a guy that could go off and can kind of do a little bit of everything. I want to say he's maybe not as mobile as I would like a defensive center to be at the next level, but I think he's so solid at so many things. Like he could probably be a reliable backup big or rotation big man for a long time because of all those things. So good shout there. And I mean, a huge Asa Newell fan, and I don't know how much stock his really can rise here, but I obviously love a lot of the things Newell brings. I've mentioned him on the pod a ton of times, and Danny Wolf as well. Like a guy I think, maybe the national stage showing off his passing even more. And if he has some big scoring performances too to go with it, maybe that could kind of like push him more into mainstream lottery talks rather than kind of late first. But he's a guy that's slowly risen throughout the season as it goes on. And, that's most of the names that come to mind. I mean, we could hit on so many different guys in terms of what could happen. Like, maybe PJ Haggerty for Memphis. He's 3rd in scoring in the whole league. They just come off this big win to win the championship of the conference over Yaxel Lendenberg, the incredible defender for UAB. So, maybe Haggerty's a guy that, you're 3rd in the country in scoring. Like you're a guy that could go off for 20 a game if you win a few games. Like I think it's that combination of like, lights up the box score, has the highlight shots, and also you make like the Sweet 16 or the Final Four or some sort of deep run where all those things where basically you become a household name for a week. That's the kind of guy we're looking for this type of conversation where you just kind of get remembered for that level of play. Even if it's a month or two later come draft time, that's one of the first things people think of you is, oh, he can handle the pressure of the biggest stage. I think ultimately it's a positive. And, should it be a deciding factor? Probably not, but maybe it's a tiebreaker. Maybe it's like one of many factors that you're weighing that's like, okay, if he can handle this against that competition and hold his own against an NBA level defender, he could probably do it in a few different areas at the next level. So I would say that's most of the names that come to mind in my mind for this exercise. There's also guys like, maybe a Liam McNeeley carves out a big run where he kind of etches in a more of a lock to be a lottery pick rather than maybe falling to the 20s. And that goes for anyone. I mean, maybe a Jase Richardson goes off in this playoff run where he is later lottery into more lock of a earlier lottery. But was there, you love Philon as well. That's a guy. Jeremiah Fears, obviously, we've mentioned, or VJ Edgecombe, we mentioned at the top of the draft. There's some guys a little later, like Chaz Lanier, 3-point shooter for Tennessee. There's Cam Jones, does a little bit of everything for Marquette. Carter Bryant has really jumped up on boards recently, even higher than he was projected. And, Jacob Toppin is a guy that's 54th on Givney's range, but maybe his team goes off. So I'm just throwing names at you. Does anyone pop out that we haven't hit on yet, or that I just mentioned where, we want to give a shout in this exercise?
So of the guys you mentioned, LaBaron Philon, definitely, he was the guy I'm a massive fan of coming out of high school, and hit the ground running. Had a little bit of an ankle injury that it was visible he was kind of struggling with in the meat of the SEC schedule, and then had a little bit of a bounce back. Tough game in the I think it was SEC semifinals against Florida. Very tough game, 1 for 9 from the field, and he's another one that just kind of fringe return. Maybe he's fallen down a lot of boards. I think he's in the second round of Gibboni's mock, maybe. But he's one that I personally would like to see come back and flesh out his game. The NBA is pretty unforgiving with, especially with guards with more unconventional games. But he's one that could maybe potentially cement himself with a handful of big games in the tournament. And Jeremiah, just to continue the theme of guards, Jeremiah Fears was one who notable. I mean, respected NBA draft people were saying, NBA draft people were saying that he should come back because he had a brutal stretch of games to start the SEC schedule, and then had a good run of things in the tournament. It's looking more than likely that he's going to declare. I think he's projected to go in the lottery at a lot of places, but I just want to see him against good comp more. He's been one that's been a little more difficult for me to get a full read on because of just the age that he's been receiving, like this level of usage and just kind of like autonomy in the offense. It's been tough for me to gauge how well should I, how to weigh kind of the warts in his game currently. Maybe give him a little bit of benefit of the doubt for being that age, playing in what's been called for the majority of the season the toughest conference in the history of college basketball. So I do want to just kind of see him against good competition, and maybe for myself get a better feel of Jeremiah Fears draft. Yeah, otherwise it's draft aside, the tournament's just a great time. I think it's going to be a great time to see who becomes the household name. What the biggest upset of the first round is. I'm just excited. I'm excited for the hoops to get underway.
No doubt. And I'm glad you gave Fears a little breakdown there, because he's a super interesting prospect where he's got that quick first step and like that, graceful decision making, like patience. Like he is calm under pressure is what it feels like. And, ever since those comments you referenced, like it seems like he's just been going off. Like he has been on a tear, it feels like, and doing it in the SEC tournament against these, like the SEC might have more top seeds than March Madness almost. Like it's insane how many great teams are in that conference this year, and he's really been great. So that's a guy I definitely want to see. Like, and another one where I don't totally understand why he would come back. Like, to me, next year's class is even more loaded, more talented, especially at the top of the draft. Like, he's not going to get more usage or opportunity next year. Like, he's a guy that has shown a lot of the pros, but like you mentioned, some cons as well. So, maybe you do want to have that development year or something like that. But to me, in terms of like NBA draft prospects, you want to get in the NBA as soon as possible, because you want to start that 7-year process to earn your unrestricted free agency rights as soon as possible, which is how you capitalize and maximize your potential earnings as a player. So if he's already this young doing this in the college scene, you probably want to break in as early as possible. And, maybe you become an unrestricted free agent 7 years in before you even hit your athletic prime around the age 25 or so. So but the contrary thought, I suppose, now in the NIL world is that maybe he could make a lot of that up by staying if the right suitor comes calling with the right amount of, guaranteed money to play at a certain school. So there is that factor as well. But, to me, I don't think his stock could really get much higher in my eyes, but he's a guy that in terms of next year, like, I don't think it is going to be if the low, like, it feels like the lowest he would go right now is like the late lottery, like 15th or just after it, like 18th. Like, Fears falling to 20 feels like it wouldn't happen this year, but next year almost could. Like, even if he does better next year because of how talented next year's class is. So that's a guy that, like, I think he's got to come out, and I really do, like you said, hope he has a great run where he's just. I saw it on a broadcast earlier. They're just happy to be out of the SEC, like for a minute. Like, just play any other team for now. That isn't just ingrained in that SEC culture. So can't wait for March Madness to start. I love how the bracketology people they set up this second round. Everyone's talking about the coaches like Calipari and Patino in a possible second round. Everyone's ignoring the Danny Wolf revenge game against Yale that could ultimately happen in the second round. Like, what a storyline. And that's another guy that jumped onto my scene. John Polakaitis, I believe is how you say his name. Shout out to him, like a bucket getter on Yale who can shoot the lights out. Like, that's where the real storyline, the real matchup is in my book. But no, just excited for all these different ways that March Madness could go. That's like just a fun one that popped out when I saw the schedule drop. So excited just to see, everything that could happen. And so I'd say let's leave it on this. Let's go ahead and make one prediction. Is out of all the names we've hit today, who do you think is the guy that ultimately wins a few games, like is the March Madness darling of the tournament? Let's just, we could be totally wrong, but let's just pick our
draft guy. Perspective, from a draft perspective, or just
tournament overall? I'd say let's stick with the draft perspective. Yeah. Like whose stock ultimately rises the most in the projected, like, to be clear to the listeners, this doesn't mean he's definitely going to get picked this high, but whose stock on a consensus media level, like who's going to see their name rise the highest on the next mock draft after March Madness because of their play during it?
I mean, there's only so many spots he could rise, but I think the matchups have been laid out so that Derik Queen has a really nice run of things to start this tournament. I think, like, looking at the first handful, like from Grand Canyon to the winner of Memphis and Colorado State, and then I would probably bet on Florida if they were to win 2 games, Florida being their third game. I think that is a nice stretch of things for Derik Queen to kind of, again, like, very unorthodox player, but I think he could be a guy that I think people really heavily consider as, in the upper echelon of draft prospect.
There it is. That's a great pick. We hardly even touched on him today. I think he will. We kind of mentioned earlier in the Ace Bailey discussion as a guy that could maybe like jump up to that third consensus pick, but at the very least, like he could work his way into the top 5 in that group. Where that's the other part of this is that when there's such a wide tier range of outcomes for guys where it feels like 3 through say 14 could go any direction, that's, I think, where guys can really etch out a slot for themselves and really like pencil themselves in higher on that mock draft because it's such an unknown and they are the known entity that has proven it on the biggest stage at the last moment possible where everyone's watching. And that's really, like you said with Queen, like a deep run in the March Madness, taking a somewhat easier path maybe than some other teams. Still good competition. All these teams are really good, but Queen he dropped 30 the other day against Michigan in the conference tournament as well. Like if he puts up big numbers, a few highlights, wins a few games in March, like that's a great shout for somebody that can kind of lock themselves in. Maluach too, as you did off the top of the pod, either guy really could just kind of lock themselves into that top 5 range when they just simply have not been top 5 locks throughout this whole process. Even if a lot of people, especially in Swish theory circles, can see them. And CMB isn't in the tournament, so shout out to him. He's probably not going to see his stock rise or fall or anything like that, but he's another guy that the whole Swish theory team just loves what he could be. I'm going to go with one of these mid-major guys. I think ultimately is who sees the biggest benefit. Stirtz really comes to mind for a guy that could see the biggest stock riser because he's a guy that could go undrafted. He might not even be in the draft, but he's also a guy that is just a very stereotypical, like he's on the team that we all think could be the Cinderella team for a couple rounds in Drake, that plays a certain way where he does everything for this team. They live and die by him. So if he's a guy that just goes off for a few games, they're the Cinderella story of it all. That's a guy that could go from on the fringe of being drafted to now we're talking about him as a potential maybe late first round pick or early second round pick. Like that's a 20, 30 pick swing from his projected slot at the moment. That's where I think probably the biggest gap of who could see the biggest jump in March Madness. So I'll go with Bennett Stirtz. So that's the pick for now. But there's a lot of fun names here. I'm really glad we kind of dove into the March Madness, but from an NBA draft perspective. So NBA fans that might not be as familiar with the college game, they're just going to start watching today to kind of start priming themselves for the draft. Like, who should they look out for? We just gave you 30 names. So you should be more than prepared for your mock NBA drafts going forward. But, I really appreciate you taking the time. It was a lot of fun talking hoops.
Absolutely, man. Always.
You already know. Thanks again for hopping on the pod today, Ahmed. And, I can't wait to see how March Madness plays out. We'll have to see come NBA draft time. Maybe we'll get a little Swish Theory mock or Swish Theory big boards involved. They'll be coming out on the website. Maybe you'll see a little video or a podcast about it too. We'll see. It's up in the air. But, you got anything else you want to tease with Swish Theory coming up anytime soon?
Yeah, hope to get a piece out on a few of the guys we just mentioned in VJ Edgecombe, Miles Byrd, and Bennett Stirtz. Hopefully get that out next week or so. And then from there, just doing draft content and maybe some grassroots season kicking up in just a handful of weeks. So hopefully get some grassroots primer out in that time. So just keep an eye out at Slip the Screen, and we'll see what we have coming down the pipe.
You already know. Maybe a new podcast around the corner. Who knows?
Maybe.
I like it, no doubt. Well, thanks again for taking the time. It's a lot of fun. Always fun talking hoops.
Yes, sir. See ya.
Have a good one.
With Ryan.
Learning Basketball is a Swish Theory podcast hosted from Beyond the Arcade. Hey, that's me. You can find my work on Twitter, YouTube, Substack, and check out the team's writing at theswishtheory.com.